Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Particular Baptist Podcast. Excuse me. You can find us and other podcasts at reformpodcast.com. Also, check out our blog at theparticularbaptist.net. And I want to give a shout out to our patrons here, Federal Theology, Jeremy, David, and others who graciously partner with us and help us as we are continuing to do what we do. We thank you for your support, and we hope that the ministry continues to be a blessing. If you would like to join our patrons, you can do so at patreon.com. That's patreon.com/the particular Baptist. Put it on the screen here. Patreon.com/particular Baptist is a great way to partner with us and support what we do. All right. Diving into our discussion today, getting back to some theology proper. I know we've talked quite a bit about theology proper on the show. We've done stuff on Aquinas, but a lot of focus on Jeffrey Johnson's book on Aquinas and some of his thinking surrounding the doctrine of God. His book, whatever his last book was, I can't remember off the top of my head. The Revealed God, I think is what it was called. But we did a review of that. So needless to say, we've done a lot of work in the space of theology proper. But I thought it'd be good to circle back around and focus a little more on a particular topic that, interestingly, when looking at the doctrine of God, seems to come up as a topic of discussion, which I guess this could apply to anything that happens in creation, but I think as it relates to the act of creation itself and what that kind of looks like from a perspective in terms, I guess maybe it's the magnitude of the act, so to speak, and the significance of it, that maybe it's discussed more than any other act, but I think it'd be good to talk about. And I want to look at it primarily from Turretin's point of view. We'll look at William Ames too, because he has some things that are helpful here. But I do think that Turretin deals with this issue directly, and I think there's things here that are helpful that we can look at. Hopefully this isn't beating a dead horse as it relates to theology proper. I think that it's something that we can always talk about, but just given the amount of time we've spent on the show talking about it, hopefully it's not, going to be too much. But I don't think it hurts to go back and talk about these things. So really the premise or the question that comes up in these discussions about the doctrine of God, who God is, when God created in Genesis, did he change? Now, I think part of the reason this question is significant is because when we're talking about the world existing versus the world not existing, it would seem that there is a change in God when the world goes from non-existence to existence, right? It would seem that there is some kind of change that is occurring, especially since when we want to talk about God in relation to the world, and we're saying, well, was God creator before the world began, or did he become creator after the world existed? What is his relationship to those things that are created? And they're definitely valid questions, I think, given our limited human understanding, and we're trying to understand the infinite. And that's something that I think we're never going to be able to come to a conclusion about in terms of being able to fully grasp these things. But, we can try to understand as best we can in our limited human capacity. But when we're talking about God changing in relation to the world, I think that we have to unlearn some things and think outside of those human categories, because we tend to think in terms of human relations, right? Like in terms of a parent A parent doesn't become a parent until that child is begotten, right? That relationship isn't established there until the child is begotten. So then the natural conclusion would be, from a human perspective, well, wouldn't that mean that God became the creator when the world was created, right? So those are things that we have to discuss in line with reconciling all these other things that we know the scripture reveals clearly about who God is. And so we have to make sure that we are following within that framework that the scriptures give us. So there are some assumptions that we do have to make. There are some assumptions that we do have to make as we are going through this. So, one, uh, these assumptions are, and this is not an exhaustive list, but I think this is a good place to start and encompasses at least the core aspects, if I can use that term, of God. God is simple, he's eternal, he's immutable, and he's infinite. So God is simple, right? He's not composed of parts. He's not made up of things that complete a whole, that make a whole, right? God is not dependent upon those things that are less than himself to be himself. He just is, right? God is not a composition of things that make him up, right? If he was, then he's not perfect. He's not self-sufficient. He's not he's not going to be able to do those things that the scripture says he does as the simple being, right? Because he would be dependent upon something outside of himself. He would be dependent upon something not God to be God. And so he's really creature at that point. Excuse me. And some drainage this morning. I promise I'm not sick. I'm at least I don't feel sick. I just woken up with some weird drainage that's making my respiratory system act weird. And then we look at God's eternality. God's simplicity, his eternality. God is eternal. He doesn't have some kind of succession of time periods that he's living under or changing in relation to, right? He just is. God is infinite, and that ties to his infinity, but his eternality. He doesn't have a beginning or an end. He's infinite in all respects. And of course, all that is tied to his immutability. God does not change, right? If God is not dependent upon something outside of himself, he obviously can't change, right? Because he is the reason for his existence, right? He is truly self-existent because he's not dependent upon something. He can't change. There's no parts that make him up. He's not dependent upon other states of being to make him who he is. And so all of those things tied together give us a framework to work out these difficult implications, such as, well, what about God being the creator, given the world doesn't exist yet? How does that relation work, right? Well, whatever we want to say about things like that, we have to make sure that those assumptions are always there, right? And we've gone through these assumptions before in one way or another on the show, so I'm not going to do an exhaustive discussion about those things. But needless to say, those are the assumptions that we have to have when going into this particular discussion. Okay, so whatever we want to say about creation in relation to God, we cannot compromise on those things. Scriptures have given us that framework. We have to interpret our understanding, or we have to interpret the scriptures and form our understanding about creation in relation to God and the other way around, and vice versa, in light of that framework. Okay. And we have to be very careful, or we could fall into idolatry. We could make God into an image that's creature like us without even trying to. So we have to have a framework by which to judge everything else in relation to when we're talking about God, and make sure that everything we say is consistent with. So we have to start at those particular areas, or we're going to find ourselves speaking less of God than we should, right? less of God than we should. Of course, we're always in some way going to speak of less of God than we should just because of our limited capacity, but we should be able to speak truthfully about God based on what he has revealed in his word and be able to speak to those things as best we can, right? Or we're not going to be following the God of Scripture. So we can avoid falling into heresy by ensuring we're keeping the categories in their rightful place, right? All right, so I'll start off a little bit with Turretin. And I'm going to be looking at Turretin quite a bit today, but I think that Turretin, he has an entire chapter in his Institutes on creation and an entire section on talking about God in relation to creation, whether he changed, and talking about divine action. And that's kind of what I want to look at today as well. This kind of goes into a broader discussion outside of just creation, but what does divine action look like conceptually, right? And that's really where Turretin is kind of going, I think. What is divine action? All right, so let's look at some Turretin, and we'll dive in. This is from his Institutes, Volume 1, page 433, if you want to go and reference it. Now, although creation is not formally a divine volition, still, on that account, there is no change made in God by it. Nor is any new perfection added to him, because it is an external and transient act which is from God, but not in him. It is made without any motion and new determination. No new will enters into him, but only a new external work proceeds from his eternal, efficacious, and omnipotent will. Nor ought any perfection to be added to him on that account, because the internal acts which perfect the operator must be distinguished from the external which perfect the work to which class creation belongs. Hence, whatever change was made by the creation was made in the creatures passing from non-existence to being, and not in God himself. So we can see here that there is a distinction that Turretin is making in the acts of God. So he's talking about external acts, or the technical term is the Latin ad extra, right? And then he's talking about internal acts. Those are acts per God's essence, or the Latin technical term is ad intra. Those are the two different categories that we see in terms of the acts of God, at least in a broad sense. You could break each of those down, I think, into some sort of categories, but these are the broader categories that we see in terms of God acting. And of course, you're going to have different schools of thought when it comes to this. The Eastern Orthodox are going to have different views of what God's acts look like. You have this energy essence distinction, typically is what you find in Eastern Orthodox, where God is not one with his actions, but where God is using some sort of external energy, almost like an aura that surrounds him, if you will, that he's utilizing to carry out the acts that he does in creation. And that's to try and preserve God's complete unknowableness from an Eastern Orthodox perspective, but also trying to hold that while also understanding that God does work in time and God does things externally of himself, and to ensure that God's acts are seen as having the ability to change without changing the creator himself. So they try to reconcile those two difficulties, those two concepts together, by saying that God uses some sort of external energy that's not one with his essence in order to do the things that he does in creation, right? God's essence energies, right? His external acts really are done by that energy, and then his divine essence is untouched or unchanged, right? Because from an Eastern Orthodox perspective, we cannot know the divine essence. It's completely unknowable. That has to be completely removed from anything that can be knowable, right? So there's some strange things there, and you certainly won't find that in the Reformed perspective, at least from Turretin's perspective. you find a distinction, at least typically, between God's external and his internal acts, while understanding that God's external acts is not some energy that he's using to do things, but it's a mere application of his perfect essence externally. And that's why you see this distinction being made. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But let's start off with looking at God's acts per his essence, or those things ad intra. And this is going to certainly be a bit more of a technical episode, but when we're talking about these things, it is a little bit more technical. And we shouldn't be afraid to use the language of the church. I mean, we're using technical language, but this was considered very basic to people like Turretin, and I would say even Ames. These were technical terms, but they were considered very elementary. By our standards, it wouldn't be, because I think we're in our Western world, unfortunately, we are not taught philosophy. We're not taught difficult concepts like this necessarily, at least at a regular, ordinary practice of education. And so I think a lot of these categories are far removed from us. But for men of like Ames' time and Turretin's time, you're going to find this was much more common in elementary. And if you didn't grasp these things, it was just seen as what's wrong with you, right? So we shouldn't be afraid to understand or look at these difficult concepts that the church has given us, even if by today's standards it would be more technical and it might take us a little bit longer to grasp them and to understand them. But that's okay. You got to start somewhere, right? Got to start somewhere. So I'm going to start with William Ames. This is from his work, The Marrow of Theology, which has a lot of really helpful things in it. Highly recommend it. It's from the Kindle edition, pages 29 to 30. He says this: a causing power, yet properly active power, doth not agree in God, if in respect of himself he were first idle, and after did put himself forth into act, for God is a most pure act, James 1:17. In other words, there's no potential in God. God is not moving from willing something to acting something out, right? It's not a properly active power where he's waiting around for something to happen, or just completely idle and then acting outside of, or acting as per that desire, right? He's not sitting idle and then he puts them forth into action. He's not changing in that way. So there's no potential in God's essence ad intra. He is the fullness of vitality. So he doesn't move from one act to another like we do. He doesn't go from idleness to action and then from action to idleness, right? God is a most pure act. And notice what Ames says here. He says, for God is a most pure act. It doesn't say that God has many actions ad intra. God is a most pure act. This is who he is. He is act itself. He is pure actuality, right? He's fully realized, fully vital in himself, right? There's no idleness in God. He's the perfection of all those things. God is not waiting to become something that he is already not, right? God is the fullness of vitality as per his own nature and essence. And it's interesting that Ames uses James 1:17 as that proof text. James 1:17, which I think many of us probably know. James, let me get it up here. James 1:17. Every good and perfect gift, every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. So every good gift comes from God, but there's no shadow of turning or variation, right? If God was going from idleness to action and action to idleness, that's variation, that's change, right? So Ames sees James 1:17 as clearly teaching that God does not change. There is no variation or shadow of turning. God does not change. There's no variation in who he is. There's no fluctuation. There's no greater one day, less the next day. There's no variation of being. He is. He's a most pure act. And so that means that God cannot move from idleness to action and action to idleness. He cannot change in that way. So I find it interesting that he uses that passage, and it's a very helpful passage. So that's looking at his, those works that are ad intra, per his essence. And there are distinct works in God that are per his essence. For instance, the Trinity itself, right? The Trinity itself, the relationships between the three members of the Trinity, right? The members of the Trinity, the Father begetting the Son, the Spirit spirating from the Father and the Son, right? Those relationships that are happening there, those distinct internal works as per relation, right? But those are not becoming something or stopping somewhere. They are the fullness of vitality, fully realized actions, right? But when we're talking about action outside of God, God's acts at extra or outside of himself, these have to be spoken of very differently. And these are acts that have a beginning and an end, depending on God's decree, of course, his will. Creation has a beginning, and so the act must be outside of God and not ad intra act, or not an ad intra act, or that would mean God is finite, since God's internal acts are nothing but his divine essence. So an act that has a beginning cannot really be in God, because that would imply that God is not eternal, infinite, immutable, or simple, right? He's taking on a new state of being. He's changing, right? So all of those fundamental principles are undermined directly if we hold to that view. So we have to speak of God's external works very differently. We have to speak of those works very differently, because anything outside of God has a beginning and has at least its ultimate origin in God himself, since Romans 11:36 says that all things come from God, right? Or from him, to him, and through him are all things, right? They all come from God. And so we, creatures, or anything that is in existence, has some sort of finite nature because it had to begin, and most things will have an end, right? Because of the creaturely nature of them. So we have to ensure that we're understanding who God is ontologically, or from in essence perspective, and also those things that are in creation. We have to understand the nature of those things. And by understanding the nature of God and understanding the nature of those things in creation, it helps us to frame this discussion properly. And there will be things that we'll scratch our head still and go, wow, I don't know how that fully works out by implication. But I know that because X is true and Y is true, Z must be true, right? Even if I can't explain all the mechanical details of Z, X and Y are true. So Z must be true by necessary consequence. Excuse me. All right, let's look at Ames again. Ames is very helpful. He has some very helpful things on divine action. This is from page 30 of the Marrow of Theology Kindle edition. Therefore, we must not imagine such an active power in God, which is a different thing from his essence. For the very essence of God is this power whereby he is powerful, as the same essence is mercy itself, whereby he is merciful. So God performing an act outside of himself only changes that which is being created, and not God himself, since God is just applying his already perfect essence in a way that produces a temporal effect outside of himself. So basically what Ames is saying here, so he's saying that the active power in God is not different from his essence, right? If we said that God's internal acts were different from his essence, that means that God is now broken up He's composed of his acts and his essence, right? We don't want to say that. His acts ad intra are his essence, right? All his actions ad intra are his essence. And so when we're talking about external works, those works have to be completely distinct from his essence. And we have to try to understand them in relation to those works that he does ad intra. So what God is doing is he's applying his already perfect essence, because God is, like we said, he's pure act. He is the fullness of vitality. He is the fullness of actuality. There's no potential in God. There's no potential movement from idleness to action. God is the fullness of action. Now, that doesn't mean that God brings into effect everything that could be, but it does mean that in himself, everything that is actual, that could be actualized, at least from a divine essence perspective, is fully actualized, at least in internally as it relates to his pure actuality. So anything externally is God's completely independent application of his pure actuality to things outside of himself. So those are the basic concepts of ad extra, ad intra, action of God. And of course, there's a lot more that could be said. I mean, entire books have been written that have long expositions on these things. And of course, today is not meant to be exhaustive. It's meant to whet your appetite, to get you started, to give you some of the basic terminology and concepts. And of course, I'm giving you some very helpful primary source material here that I hope you can go and study more. And of course, there's other men that have written, and maybe I'll mention some of these at the end that can be helpful. All right, let's look at Turretin again. So how does all of this apply to creation? Right? We've touched on it a little bit, but kind of summing up here, how does all of this apply to creation? Creation, and this is Turretin again. Creation can be considered in two ways, either actively, inasmuch as it belongs to God, and so it is not indeed a practical volition in God formally, because arising from it as its immediate principle, but is a transient act of God by which he confers being upon created things, or passively, inasmuch as it belongs to the creature passing from a state of non-existence to existence, not by a change properly so called, the transient of a pre-existing subject from one term to another, but a common and general change, implying any inception, whatever of a thing. Thus arises the relation existing between God and creature and his creatures, which, although adding nothing new to God and indicating only an extrinsic habitude to the creature, is yet properly called real, both because it stands between real extremes and because the reason of founding it on both sides occurs on the part of the thing, even no one thinking. The creature being made, God always holds the relation of creator to it, and it in turn depends upon and is related to him as the creature, even if no one would think of him. So, very technical discussion here from Turretin, but I'm going to try and break this down a little bit. So, what Turretin is laying out here are differences between, again, God's acts ad extra and ad intra relating to creation specifically. Basically, the actions of God outside of himself only change that which is being affected, and in this case, creating something out of nothing. So he talks about passive action versus active action, right? So in the sense of something going from non-existence to existence, that would be called passive. It's creating something from absolutely nothing, and so there's a change that's happening there to the thing, versus what happens with active volition, where the thing is being acted upon that already exists, right? So this is what Turretin calls a general change. It's the inception or creation of any given thing. So the point is, God creates by applying his perfect essence to something outside of himself. He remains unchanged, and the creature changes by virtue of coming into that existence. Creation coming into that existence. So what about God being eternal and creation finite? Sorry, my wife is writing me about something important here. Okay, sorry about that. Now, what about God being eternal and creation finite? This goes back to what we talked about earlier. How if the world was created out of nothing and didn't exist before, how can we say that God eternally is, the creator, at least in some sense, right? Now, Turretin makes clear here there is a relation that arises between God and his creatures, right? By virtue of this thing that goes into existence, right? The creature being made, God always holds the relation of creator to it and in turn depends upon and is related to him as the creature, right? So there is a relation that comes out of something being created. That's what Turretin is saying here. So I think there's one sense where God is always the creator by virtue of his eternal acts, right? His eternal acts ad intra don't change. God is always going to eternally be acting. But in terms of when that happens in time depends on his decree. That doesn't mean just because God acts, there's a necessary effect immediately, right? From God's perspective, that's not the case. But the relation arises. When a creature is created, that relation of creature is created between God and the creature. So the creature takes on the relation of creature, and God has the relation of creator. But this does not add anything to God's perfect essence, as Turretin says, but there is a relation that is there. So in one sense, from a relational perspective, God becomes the creator. I'm saying that very loosely and just relationally. It does not add anything to God, does not change who he is. He becomes the creator in as much as that relation is created upon the creation of the creature's existence. But there's also a sense where God always is the creator by virtue of his eternal action, right? So even though that relation between the creature and creator has not been established in time yet, there is a sense where God is always creator by virtue of his eternal action. He is doing the prerogative of creating, right? By virtue of his very nature in action, right? Ad intra. So difficult concepts, but that's, I think, the best way to look at it from where I stand. And I'll look a little bit into Turretin here. But Turretin does see the relation coming onto the scene when the creator or the creature is created, right? It's not a relation that God has. You can't have a relationship with something that doesn't exist, right? That doesn't make any sense. That is non-existence, right? But we can say by virtue of God's eternal action that he is creator. So there's these categories that Turretin is bringing out here. So Turretin again, although God did not create from eternity, he did not on that account change from potency to act and from leisure to work. For agents who act by volition alone differ from those in whom laborious effects are required besides the volition. The latter, in the production of their work, pass from potency to act, from volition to the effecting. This is not so with the former, who act by a mere volition, as God, as he willed the existence of the world in time, so he willed it from eternity. And thus a certain change was made in the world, which passed from non-existence to existence, but not in God, who, remaining in himself the same, produced by his practical volition a thing from nothing out of himself. So he's talking about different kinds of action here. Divine action versus creaturely action, right? And this, I found this to be really helpful when I was reading Turretin, because I think just in our natural state as human beings, we like to put everything in the context that we understand it to be from our perspective. We have to guard against that when we're talking about God. So I think Turretin's breaking down of these categories is really helpful. God acts by volition alone, while creatures act by volition plus the action needed to bring about the effect, right? Because we're not one with our actions. God is, right? We're not. We have to go and do something that is not part of us in order to bring about a specific effect, right? So God acts on volition alone. God is not taking on new states of being and labor, or has to depend upon that labor in order to bring about the effect, right? So God is acting on volition alone. So there's no change in him. God is one with his works. God acts on that volition and does not need to then add the work to production in order to bring the effect. He simply wills it, and it is so accordingly, since God is his will and his actions. There is no movement from will to work to effect. All that is in God is God. So his willing is his working, and the effect is produced at the appointed time. So God doesn't need to take on something that he doesn't already have, or depend upon something that isn't him, because God's willing is his working, right? So if God's willing is his working, he's just acting by volition. He wills it and it happens, right? He wills it and it happens. As for creatures, we have to will something and then go do the work to bring it into effect, right? We have to depend upon the actual labor in order for the effect to happen, right? So we're depending upon something that is not us to do something that we want. As for God, God's willing is his working. And so, because of God's simplicity, he does not need to depend on those things, right? So Turretin can rightly say, produced by his practical volition, a thing from nothing out of himself, right? It's coming from God. It's not coming from some work that he had to depend upon in order to bring about creation. It came out of him because of who he is as the willing working one, right? It's pretty neat. And again, I found this section in Turretin's Institutes to be really helpful in understanding these things, because he's breaking down the creaturely categories of work versus divine categories of work. And it helps us, I think, at least it helped me to better understand what's going on here when we're talking about God acting. Of course, our creaturely language is going to only say so much, but I think it helps us to carefully guard our language, right? Carefully guard our language, stay within the proper categories, those safe categories that are consistent with biblical revelation of who God is, and I think help us to properly ensure that we are not veering off where we shouldn't be. And then Turretin again. This is my final quote from Turretin. Hopefully, I haven't exhausted everybody yet with Turretin. I know he can be quite technical, but I think Turretin is one of the best works that we have for Reformed theology. That doesn't mean I agree with him on everything, but I think on the fundamentals, I think you're going to find more than enough that is there from a biblical perspective. But this is my final quote from Turretin. He says, "An action, according to its totality, being posited, the effect immediately follows. But creation was not posited from eternity according to its totality. Although it was as to its principle, still it was not as to its terminus. Although it was an internal and immanent act in God, it was not an external act passing over into the creature." So this goes back to the discussion about God being the creator as per his action versus relation, right? So Turretin would agree that God is creator from eternity. The act of creation was something, at least from an ad intra perspective, something that was from eternity. But a completed act is not considered complete until it actually produces the effect, right? It has to actually produce the effect for it to be considered a complete action, or it's not considered complete, right? So, from one perspective, God's act of eternity of creation was an eternal act because it was internal and immanent in God, right? But as it relates to it being a completed act, passing over into the creature, making the creature go from non-existence to existence, that did not happen, right? So in one sense, I think the conclusion we can come to here, in one sense, God is eternal creator, in as much as the action is eternal as per his immanent and internal action of nature. But from its external termination in the creature, bringing about the effect, no, it was not, right? So again, Turretin, I think, helpfully breaking down these categories and make sure we're thinking about it from the creature's perspective. From the creature's perspective, no, it wasn't complete because the creature didn't exist. But from God's perspective, there was an actual action taking place eternally. Otherwise, we have to say that God's actions are starting. He's going from idleness to action, right? Which Turretin has said, no, that's not the case, which would bring about change in God, which would undermine James 1:17, right? So Turretin is trying, I think, to very carefully keep these categories in check and balance them out properly from a biblical perspective. He's working from the framework that I laid out initially: his simplicity, his immutability, his eternality, his infinity. He's keeping those things always at the forefront of his mind and trying to work these things out for us. And I think that he does a very good job of that here, even albeit the language is quite technical. But I think the categories, again, help us to keep our language guarded, to help us to ensure that we're not falling into heresy, and to ensure that we're speaking of God according to who he is, the God who is not like us in any way, the God who is completely distinct from us in no category of creatures, no genus, no species, no category. God is unique, right? There is no one like him. There's no one like him. And so we have to make sure our language is consistent with that principle, right? Our language is consistent with that principle. So the answer to the question, did creation change God? Absolutely not. Has God always been the creator? Yes. In one sense, he has always been the creator by virtue of the eternal act that is internal and immanent, right? But in terms of the relation between the creature and the creator, no, he was not. So again, we have to speak in those categories so that we ensure that we're not falling into heretical doctrine and that we are not creating an idol, because we can do that very easily if we're not careful, just because of who we're talking about. So we have to be very careful when we speak about God. We have to be solemn when we speak about God, not be flippant with who God is, not be flippant in speaking about who he is when we're trying to work through these things. And I'm not claiming to have a perfect understanding of God. I'm sure, and I know there are times where I have had serious misunderstandings about who God is. But for true Christians, where we slip in those areas, God, by his Spirit, will help us to understand those things. God will help us to turn away from any kind of idolatrous understandings of who he is in our minds. If we're true Christians, we won't stay there. We won't stay there. So we grow and we learn, but we still have to, it requires us to read. And I would encourage you to dig into these sources. Turretin's Institute's very helpful resource in this area. William Ames, The Marrow of Theology, very helpful in this area. And there's also some men of modernity that I think are helpful too, that can be helpful in this area. Adonis Vidu, his works, he talks about, he has an entire book on divine action, talking about the inseparability of God's operations. Ad extra. You can even read from some of the men like Jim Renahan and their commentary on confession, and even some of the old guys, Nehemiah Cox, Vindication of the Truth, talking to Thomas Collier. The very first chapter is on God's subsistence, on the doctrine of God. There's some very helpful things in there. So there's a lot of material. You just have to be willing to read and listen and be humble. You have to be humble. You have to be humble, willing to have your assumptions about God challenged that may not be biblical, may not be sound, and be willing to have your mind shaped by what the scriptures reveal of these things, right? Not what I think, but what does scripture reveal about God, and be willing to lay aside those presuppositions that may be unbiblical, right? Even if it leads you into some places that make you scratch your head and you're like, man, That's beyond my understanding. When you've reached that point, you know you're pretty much in the right place. Yes, when you reach that point, when you're working through these godly men who are giving biblical and godly counsel in these areas, you know you've reached the right place. When you're like, I don't know. Yes, I have all these categories down, but I feel even more lost than I was when I first started. That means you're getting away from understanding God as a creature, and you're getting closer to understanding who he is, at least as much as we can from a human perspective. That's a sure sign that you are on the right path. All right. I hope this has been helpful, everyone. Again, a more technical episode today, but I hope it's been helpful and a blessing to you. And I hope it gives you a desire to go and read the primary source material. That is one of our missions here at the Particular Baptist. We want to get Reformed primary source material in front of you. We want people to go back to the sources, to study our heritage. We want to recover these things. We want to put these things out in front of people so that they can read them, they can learn from them, they can grow in their understanding of the truth, and it can help with their Bible study. So these things are they're either not known or they're neglected, or people, even some people in our own circles, are right off some of the substantial fundamental things of these guys as philosophy, and we can't do that. That's not biblical. I'm a biblicist. That's just foolishness. We should read these men. These men God has gifted to us. God has given us in the day and age that we have in the digital age. Oh my goodness, we don't really have any excuse anymore to not look at these things because of how abundantly available they are. I mean, Turretin's work is a more recent work that's been translated because I believe it was written in Latin or French. And in the 90s, it was published. But I mean, we have these things now, and we can go and look. There's so many free things online of these old works that you can go and look up. We have so much at our fingertips. So take advantage of it, brothers. Take advantage of the resources that we have. It's a fantastic way for us to grow, and God has given that to us to help us to grow. I know for me, reading the old dead guys of our tradition, or many of the old dead guys of our tradition, I think is helped me to grow in ways that spiritually, in my understanding of the scriptures, that I would never have gotten. I don't think ever have gotten just by reading a modern work that has no reference point, that does not heavily directly rely on primary source material, because we're so disconnected from that world, from the categories that are there. And I think that, we need to be reading more primary source material. We need to be reading more primary source material. And thankfully, there are many men today who are involved in that recovery, trying to publish works, trying to put these things out in front of people. We want people to be able to understand these things. So hopefully this has been helpful and can point you to some helpful resources. But with that, everyone, thank you for joining me today. And Lord willing, we will be back next week. Take care.